In this video, we are going to implement RIP on our little lab network that we've set up. Here's the network that we used for our static routing, and I've not done anything to this network since the last time we saw it. We saw how static routes were evil, and they should be destroyed with fire, and we're going to do just that in this lab. We're going to implement RIP on all three of these routers and show you how the routes are distributed from one end of the network to the other, and then we're going to go add a route, add it to RIP, and see that it shows up on the other two routers. So let's get started. First off, we'll start with the Atlanta router since it's right in the middle, and my preference is just to start with the most central location and work your way out. That way, once you enable it over here in Sacramento, you know it's working immediately because you'll start seeing routes from the Atlanta router come in. So here we are. First thing we'll do is go into config mode, so config T, and we'll type router RIP, which is the command to enter RIP configuration mode. If we look at the help here in RIP, we see the commands that we can use to configure RIP on this particular device. Now, the ones we're going to be using is auto summary to enable auto summarization for our classless networks. And actually, we're going to be turning that off because by default, RIP has auto summary on and it summarizes networks at classful boundaries. And you'll see why that's kind of a bad idea once we turn it on and leave auto summary off. We'll also be using the network command to tell RIP what networks it should redistribute into the routing protocol. And we'll also be using the version command to set it to version 2. And you'll recall from our discussion of RIP that you always want to use version 2 because version 1 does not respect the subnet mask. It basically summarizes everything. In this case, we'll go ahead and turn on version 2. And then we're going to say, redistribute all of my 192.168 networks into RIP. So we'll do network 192.168.1.0 and hit enter. And then we'll just hit the up arrow and change that to a 2.0 and hit enter. So now at this point, we are redistributing 192.168.1 and 2 into RIP. We are advertising them through RIP because redistribution is an entirely different subject. And so now we can look at our RIP configuration. We do show IP RIP database, and we see that it's auto-summarizing 192.168.1.0 at its classful boundary, which is /24, and 192.168.2.0 auto-summarizes its classful boundary, which is a /24. It does not respect the fact that we have a /30 subnet mask on these point-to-point links. And that'll come into play here in a little bit, but for the time being, let's move on to our Sacramento router. So in Sacramento, we are going to do the same thing, config T, router RIP. We're going to do version 2 because the versions have to match on all of our RIP routers. And then we will do network 192.168.1.0. And then we will do network 10.10.1.0. So now we're over here on Sacramento. Let's do show IP RIP database over here. And you'll notice that RIP is already learning about the routes to the 192.168.2.0 network. It's learning it via 192.168.1.2, which is the Atlanta router. So the Atlanta router is advertising this entire class C as being behind me. If we go over to Atlanta and we look at the RIP database over here, we see that the entire 10.0/8 network is being advertised behind 192.168.1.1. But that's not actually the case in our network. We have part of the 10. network over here in Sacramento and part of it over here in Charlotte. So if Sacramento and Charlotte are both advertising the classful 10. networks, then the traffic won't get to the actual destination because Atlanta will just kind of load balance. It'll say, well, I have routes to the 10. network out both of my serial interfaces, so I'll just split the traffic between them. Half the traffic for Charlotte will end up in Sacramento and vice versa. This is why you always want to turn auto summarization off. And that's not true just with RIP, but with many routing protocols. You want to summarize where you tell it to summarize and not necessarily on classful boundaries. Because to be completely honest, it's a very rare network indeed that allows you to summarize across classful boundaries in perpetuity, meaning that you'll always be in an expansion mode in most businesses. And so you'll acquire a business over here in Charlotte, and then you'll acquire one in Raleigh, and then you'll acquire one in Philadelphia. And those networks may not be inside that same classful range for the East Coast. So now that I've gone through all that, let's go into the RIP configuration in Sacramento and Atlanta and turn off auto summarization, and we'll see what the difference is in the routing table. So config T, do router RIP, and we'll do no auto summary. Let's go ahead and write the config just to be on the safe side. We'll go over to Atlanta and do exactly the same thing. Config T, router RIP, and then no auto summary. So now if we do show IP RIP database on this guy, it still shows an auto summary because RIP has not advertised the network. So we'll pause here for a few seconds so that RIP can advertise out properly, and then we'll look at this database here in just a bit. And actually, this is probably a little bit of a bug in my network virtualization software here. I actually had to clear the route database in order to get this guy to show up. So it still shows an auto summary here, but it also has a more specific network, 10.10.10/24, via this guy. So we'll carry on with configuring our RIP in Charlotte, and then we'll show you how having a routing protocol on board can make your life a lot easier.